Thanks very much, Rob, for a generous introduction. I'm glad to be here and to be able to speak. As some of you probably know, I was supposed to present this lecture a couple of years ago, but due to an unforeseen and sudden personal event, I was unable to do so. So I'm doubly glad that the editorial board and the editors of Progressive Human Geography didn't think twice about the decision they made then and requested that I come back and do this now. It's very much a changed lecture, obviously, given conditions in the world, but I'm glad to be here, so thank you very much. I'm not going to go through the names of all of the folks on the editorial board and the editors, friends and colleagues, but thank you. I think it's hard to talk today about the political context in which geography finds itself, thinking about progress in human geography, both in terms of ideas but in terms of practice, without having a very sharp eye on the events that have been taking place in North Africa and Southwest Asia. And with that in mind, I went back again to a quote that I think I was going to use actually in the first lecture from Coetzee, J.M. Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians, which I'm sure a number of you have read. So let me just start with that quote and give you a sense of it. Empire has located its existence not in the smooth, recurrent, spinning time of the cycle of the seasons, but in the jagged time of rise and fall, of beginning and end, of catastrophe. Empire dooms itself to live in history and to plot against history. One thought alone preoccupies the submerged mind of empire. How not to end, how not to die, how to prolong its era. Now in North America and in Western Europe, I think since certainly 1968 and its aftermath, the prospect of revolutionary change has receded into the far distance of our collective political imaginations, eventually crossing the line where revolutionary aspiration became conflated with unabashed utopianism. Literally, a prospect that has no place in the world. Insofar as proclamations of the end of history held sway among conservatives in the 1990s, this was an age in which revolution was equally out of time. Revolution belonged firmly in the past. All possible futures already are always present. To the extent that revolutions and revolt defied such self-assured endism and had the temerity to happen in any case, they happened somewhere else, and they were generally treated as leftover details from an obsolete history, or as pathetic Canutian gestures against the capitalist time. Or else, in the USSR, in Eastern Europe and elsewhere in the Soviet bloc, they were cast as mopping up operations. Evidence for rather than against the end of history. Evidence for the futility of revolution, except that is, of course, of the capitalist variety. Confirmation of the fruition of capitalism and of bourgeois democracy. A certain ideological universalism embedded in the DNA of the empire of capital reasserted itself as the only alternative, the present as the only possible future, here as the only possible elsewhere. The neoliberal moment of capitalism, therefore, crafted its own plot against history, in Coetzee's words, which was simultaneously, of course, a plot against geography. The central argument, really, that I want to explore here is that we are now, I think, it's fair to say, in a wholly different moment than we would have thought we were in 5 years ago. No longer out of place, out of time, as it were. No longer so feebly caught within the webs of the combined plots against history and geography. Perhaps we can cautiously suggest that the present political predicament is breaking out of a visceral redifferentiation and hence repoliticization of time and space. A moment of more intense remaking of history and geography. A victory of lived history and lived geography over plots against them. New sparks of revolt are clearing away a lot of ideological undergrowth, while just as surely deploying and creating existing and new ideologies at the same time. In this context, long-existing aspirations for an anti-capitalist transition resurface, but can seem worn out, uninspiring. They linger on at times as vague prescriptions issuing from familiar analyses. Their abstraction falls on the wrong side of the revolutionary moment. In the face of concerted action, their sufficiency is limited. Now, of course, the biggest spark today obviously comes from the so-called Arab Spring. And to the extent that we retrospectively recognise the present as the beginning of something new, what precisely, of course, we don't yet know, the recent revolts will surely be codified as some kind of a founding moment of that new period. But the jumble of signs, of causes and of movements that have erupted over the last months, and indeed over the last years, have their own roots and are far more diverse and multiple than this appellation of an Arab Spring would suggest. Nonetheless, I think, these signs have conspired to produce a kind of counter-plot against the closed histories and geographies of what we came to know as capitalist globalization. Now, political commentators and academics are already parsing the significance of the revolts in North Africa and Southwest Asia in terms of familiar, revolutionary, historical geographies. Is the Arab Spring comparable to the 1968 Hot Spring, we hear? Or does the amalgam of economic, political and social struggles that comes together after a police attack on Mohamed Bouazizi, a university-educated street vendor, on December 17th in the central town of Sidi Bouzid, does this transcontinental uprising now represent something wholly new as against 1968? Has the revolutionary impulse of Tahrir Square been opportunistically diverted into a thinly concealed military coup, as some have argued? Or do the Tunisian and Egyptian revolts compare with the February Revolution of 1917, building toward their own October? What do we take from the Western media ideologies framing these events as little more than a Facebook or a social media revolution? Will heavy state repression elsewhere, in the streets of Bahrain, Yemen, Syria, and in other states, at the costs ultimately across the entire region of thousands of lives, will these events, these repressions, face powerful opposition, as in Libya, where now the uprising has become a war of international dimensions? Will the uprising spread to Saudi Arabia, especially in the Sunni East, as many indeed anticipate? Will attempts at NATO intervention in Libya, as in Libya, in the name of humanitarianism, but equally, of course, to make the region safe, safe that is for capitalist democracy, will such movements continue to take place? Will that be the result of the so-called Arab Spring? Will self-interested intervention from the West further inflame the region or incite new revolts beyond the current battlefield? Insofar as the significance of the hot spring of 2011 is still yet to be realised, quite literally, it is obviously too soon for any definitive accounting, but it already seems likely that in retrospect we will increasingly come to see recent months and possibly recent years, and years as they unfold today, as the beginning, a superseding of a well-declared end. The beginning of something new may now be squeezing aside the end of something old. The sense of living through history in the making edges aside the doldrums of late neoliberalism. Now, with that as an introductory vignette, if you like, I really want to move toward the central nexus of the discussion I'd like to have this afternoon. And that really is the nexus between revolution and ideology. And again, this is something that perhaps hasn't really been possible until the present moment with the upsurges that we are indeed witnessing. As a background, let me just make three kinds of comments. This is a project I'm trying to work on as part of a book-length presentation that connects revolution and ideology. And part of it comes from a piece of work I did a couple of years ago, which some of you may have seen, called The Revolutionary Imperative, which is very much based on a kind of historical but theoretical pursuit, exploration. But second, it's based too on an argument about neoliberalism itself. And that argument really is quite simply put, and with apologies to Habermas, who uses the same phrase in a different context, that neoliberalism as a particular moment of capitalism is dead but dominant. And it takes some exploration of that topic as well to give a full context to the present argument that I want to make. However, I'm not going to get into either of those two contextual settings, if you like, for the present discussion. The third contextual argument that I really want to just emphasize is, and I don't usually quote Warren Buffett of Hathaway fame, but Warren Buffett just a couple of years ago said something that struck me as extraordinarily true, much truer than many of the things that we read in our own social science literature, when he said, "There's class warfare all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning." Now, against that kind of truth, we always have to ask ourselves why it is indeed that we're closeted in universities trying to find the truth when men like Warren Buffett are quite happy to give it up to us, and in the case of Warren Buffett, perhaps extraordinarily, to give it up to us for free. So the argument I want to make is really one about ideology. And just to give you a sense of the signposts, I'm going to start by talking about ideology, the theory of ideology, as cold theory in the title. I've talked to you a bit about hot spring as the context, but I want to talk about cold theory and the theory of ideology in particular. I want to move on and ask why ideology has become a bit of a cold case that needs to be pursued and its murderer sought out. And from there I want to have a discussion to some extent about the alternatives to ideology that have emerged, in particular the language of discourse. And at that point then to come back and begin to rethink how we can resuscitate what I take to be a very valuable contribution to the socio-political literature, indeed a theory of ideology. So let me start out with ideology and the cold theory of ideology. What do we mean by ideology today? Well, I think that's a fairly easy question to answer. Ideology today, in most of our usages, ideology is really an empirical generalization. Ideology is a kind of descriptor for a world view. One's ideology is a bundle of ideas that explain the world to us. It's a kind of systematic way of thinking about the world. It's a set of foundational beliefs. It involves the connection between ideas and action. Ideologies may be held by individuals, but they may equally be collective in their holding. They may be collectively held. There's also a sense, when we call something an ideology, a sense of the notion of a doctrine. There's something doctrinaire about ideologies. There's a pejorative sense to ideology, a closed-mindedness, if you will. And yet at the same time, if we're honest, in our sense of ideology today, and again I think this has changed dramatically in the last 2, maybe 3 decades, there's a real relativism to our notion of ideology. You have your ideology, I have mine. That way of thinking about ideology really is qualitatively new, at least since the 1970s, it seems to me. Now, that's a fairly enfeebled concept, I think we would all admit. There's not much in the way of ideas that wouldn't fit under that sense of ideology. And that, of course, leads to the fairly obvious conclusion that if everything is ideology, then really not much, nothing is ideology at all. There's a kind of a loss of any kind of critical content to the concept of ideology that we find ourselves inheriting. And when I say a critical concept, I want to be very particular about this as well. I'm thinking especially about Lefebvre's analysis of critical concept, where he describes a critical concept as an analysis which is simultaneously an accusation and an imperative. An analysis that is an accusation and an imperative. And that seems useful to me. We'll come back to it. Now, it's also clear, I think, that historically ideology has not been as vacuous a concept as it is today in social theory and in intellectual circles more broadly. And in fact, referring to the critical nexus that I want to be looking at today, revolution and ideology, it's not an accident that the idea of ideology was itself, of course, coined in the context of revolution and the aftermath of revolution. The ideologues emerging from the French Revolution in the 1790s were a group of philosophers, social thinkers more broadly, who sought to form what Destutt de Tracy, one of their number, referred to as a science of ideas. These were philosophers who were very much on the liberal end of the spectrum in the context of post-revolutionary France. And of course, they were seen very suspiciously by none other than Napoleon Bonaparte, the arch counter-revolutionary of the moment, who himself seems to have been the one who coined the term ideologues, not ideology, ideologues, to refer to this group. Now, the pejorative intention of Napoleon's coinage here is beyond doubt. Napoleon meant this as very much a put-down. But of course, that language of ideology which emerges at the turn of the 19th century reaches its apotheosis, if you like, with Marx, who more than anyone combines what Lefebvre, of course, latterly comes to talk about in his definition of a critical concept, an analysis combining an accusation and an imperative. Marx's analysis of ideology, it seems to me, builds that notion of ideology that emerges 30, 40 years earlier into a much more useful, much more powerful critical concept. And I'm going to come back to Marx's theory of ideology, you won't be surprised to learn. But there's a bit of a paradox here in terms of social theory. What I'm trying to suggest is that if we've got to the point where ideology is an enfeebled concept, ideology, the theory of ideology is indeed a cold theory, at the same time, that language of ideology is very current in the public sphere itself. There's never been a more intense screaming about the ideology of Islamic fundamentalism, to cite one example. Resurgent ideologies of class struggle, exactly what Buffett was both picking up, but to some extent arguing against, giving us the open secret of class struggle, which of course is being that recognition of class struggle being powerfully repressed. A resurgence too, of course, of nationalist ideologies vis-à-vis the global, and of other forms of localisms, of ideological localisms. So we have a kind of conundrum here between a language of ideology that's popular in the public media, and yet which has very little in the way of theoretical analysis, background, or even curiosity in the academic and intellectual worlds. And that creates a predicament, it seems to me. We're used to at the present thinking that we've got such sophisticated theories in the social theory world. Are theories that have emerged not just from Marx or from Freud, from Hegel, from the 19th century world, the early 20th century world, but the post-1968 world, the social theory from France, and elsewhere, that this whole barrage of theory gives us a very sophisticated view of the world. What I actually suggest instead is that at least if we take the theory of ideology as the linchpin, the real requirement today is not that we find, as I think has so often been lamented in the last 2 or 3 decades, that we need to find some sort of practice, some political practice, to match the power of our theory. In fact, it's the opposite way around. As regards ideology, we need to find a way of raising our theory to the level of our practice. And so we get to the question of ideology as cold case. How is it that ideology became a prime candidate for an appearance on a showing of an intellectual cold case TV show, if you like. We have the body, the idea of ideology, thoroughly dead, but who committed the crime? How do we go back and solve this cold case? What was the motive? How was the crime carried out? What were the weapons? I want to suggest that there are 3 murder suspects to this story. At least I think that's the word coming out of the intellectual yard that I inhabit. And we suspect that the 3 suspects were in different ways working together. The first is, of course, the usual suspect, the political right. Political right, of course, in the wake of 1968, has been extremely powerful. It has used the issue of ideology as a powerful critical weapon against the left itself. And of course it had to do so. The weapon of ideology was so powerful that it could not be used against the left itself. And that, of course, is already the conclusion of someone like Karl Mannheim, writing in the middle of the 20th century in a book on ideology and utopia, which is, of course, a classic if you want to go back and look at the history of ideology and the way in which questions of ideology have emerged and developed. The left notion of ideology, so powerful in its critical intent, so sharp an intellectual tool, was effectively co-opted by the right. So we have the usual suspect. The second suspect is perhaps a bit more surprising. And here I want to say that the second suspect is indeed the political left, and in particular Marxism itself. Their fingerprints are all over the body. Early on, Edward Bernstein, the German socialist, argued, really at the end of the 19th century, when the idea of ideology itself was still less than a century old, argued that we really ought to see ideology in much more generalized form. Ideology meant little more than just a descriptive summary of a group of ideas which may or may not have had political intent. Bernstein applied this notion of ideology to all kinds of bodies of ideas and of theories. And in the process, of course, divorced the concept of ideology, how we would think about ideology, from the lived social practices, the social relations, the material relations, from within which ideologies emerge and emerged. Following that, Lenin, of course, picking up on Engels, talked about false consciousness. And he did so, of course, in a highly critical way, and I'll come back and have more to say about false consciousness later. But he did so in a way which emphasized the critical character of ideology, its active, moving, processual side, if you like, rather than simply ideology as descriptor. That didn't, however, prevent that whole language of false consciousness being picked up within the Marxist tradition, and especially in the Stalinist tradition of the 1920s and later, the official communist tradition, and effectively degraded within the Marxist tradition, such that by the time you get to the post-Second World War period, ideology becomes equatable in that official communist literature with just a group of wrong ideas, political errors, false consciousness as a descriptor rather than a critical diagnosis, a one-to-one translation from class position to the proper ideas was instantiated by this particular Stalinist reading of false consciousness. Ideology was little more than bourgeois illusion in this tradition. Now, what's interesting about that language of ideology by the 1950s, I want to argue, is that it becomes quite broad-based throughout a whole series of intellectual traditions, both within the communist tradition itself, but also within traditions which either feed off or are critical of the communist tradition. So take, for example, Louis Althusser, for whom the communist tradition was still central in his political and theoretical work, but who believed quite deeply that it needed to be reformed. And for him, of course, reformed in a particularly structuralist direction. For Althusser, ideology, much like history, was something which was subjectless. ideology was a set of ideas without a subject. They were structural entities rather than produced entities. Marxism, it seems to me in this period, became in many ways its own ideological apparatus for the so-called socialist countries. And Althusser's intervention did more to instantiate that reality than to oppose it. Now, I think it's important on the left that we recognize quite soberly what this implied. And again, to go to Lefebvre, I think there's a lot of power in Lefebvre's argument that the communist movement as such, and this is a quote, left intellectual rubble in its wake. And the idea of ideology, the concept of ideology, was indeed among the rubble that was left in the wake of that communist tradition. The idea of revolution too, to some extent, although of course we're dealing with a different kind of argument. The dogmatism, if you like, that emerged from the Stalinist tradition, in a very strange way came full circle to meet the dogmatism of the right. But there's a third suspect in our cold case here. And that third suspect is perhaps more important for us today as we look at the concept of ideology and think about alternatives to it. And that, of course, is the concept of discourse, which has emerged very much as the, if I can put it this way, the lingua franca that takes the place of ideology, really since 1968, let's say since the 1970s. And in particular, let me broaden it out a bit, the post-structuralist predilection for the discussion of discourse. Now, it's not clear to me whether the body was already thoroughly dead before the knife of discourse was plunged into it. And it may take a little more medical attention than I'm capable of giving it to decide historically whether or not that's true. But there's no doubt that the question of discourse, the issue of discourse, the concept of discourse, has come to supersede the way in which we thought about ideology in the past. Discourse has become the alternative for an entirely discredited way of thinking about ideology. Now, the problem here, of course, is that discourse is self-avowedly neutral at one level in its descriptive approach to what we would call a body of ideas that previously would have been covered by the concept of ideology. It's neutral in a number of ways, and I'm not going to go into it right now, but we'll come back to once I've had more chance to talk about, in particular, a critical theory of ideology. In particular, it was exactly that neutrality that was prized, it seems to me, with the replacement of ideology by discourse, precisely that it did not commit the mistakes of a dogmatic Stalinism. And as Terry Eagleton says at one point, this reflects not so much in a careful analytical critique of ideology, much more in a pervasive nervousness about the concept of ideology within post-structural circles. Now, in addition to that kind of neutrality of the language, there is, I think it's fair to say, a whole missing question of the social interests that adhere to discourses. We can say one thing for the concept of ideology, which is that the question of social interest was always up front and personal. With the language of discourse, however, the social interests behind a particular discourse are not the point of that discourse itself. There's little way to interrogate the particular social interests from within discourse theory itself. That any interpretation or interrogation of discourse, of the social interests involved in a particular discourse, is something that has to be imported from the outside. That importation is not impossible, it's not even difficult, it's often done. But the important point here is that it is an importation which is not in and of the concept of discourse itself. The social relations, the life processes, the material events that give rise to ideology and traditional conceptualization are not themselves a part of the conceptualization of discourse. So while we tend to think of much of the social theory that emerged since the 1970s, much of it centered on questions of discourse, certainly much of it deploying arguments of discourse as fairly sophisticated intellectual rebuffs, if you like, to the French, in particular, communist tradition, it seems to me that there's another way of thinking about discourse theory. I like to think about discourse theory as a kind of traffic engineering. It's a kind of traffic engineering which, in a very sophisticated way, manages the movement of ideas and interrogates the movement of ideas along established paths. It's irreproachable in the details concerning the way in which particular discursive roads are built, discursive bridges established, crossed, other bridges perhaps brought down, new ones created. But what it does not do is to quiz the origins of the journey, the origins of this traffic in ideas. Where did the ideas start and where did they end up? Why did they start there? Why did they end up there? It is silent on why the road was built from point A to point B, instead of why a particular road, conceptual road, was built from one other place to a different place entirely. Whose social interests are served by the design of the discourse in the first place? Now, it seems to me that these questions are vital in our diagnosis of what discourse theory can and cannot tell us, especially when we put it in the context of a possible replacement for ideology. And the common retort of social constructionism, it seems to me, becomes a fairly thin alibi for critique, certainly for the sort of critique that was, at least in its intent, embodied in the notion of ideology in the first place. There's another thing that kind of bothers the literary scholar in me, wherever that may be, about discussions within the rubric of discourse theory. And that's the invocation of the passive voice. And here a rather interesting thing begins to happen. We hear a lot about how discourses emerge, how discourses are subdued, how discourses re-emerge, fade away. We don't hear much, however, about the subjects behind the creation of those discourses, the transformation of the discourses, the restructuring of the discourses, the challenges to the discourses. And discourse theory begins to look a little like the same kind of subjectless event that we saw with none other than Althusser. The connection between the class position of the subject, or the social position more broadly, the life processes of the subject, and the kind of discourses produced are not themselves embodied within the conceptualization of discourse itself. And this becomes explicit in the work, for example, of Chantal Mouffe and Laclau in the 1980s. We're drawing on much of the social theory coming out of France in the 1970s. There's an explicit attempt to disconnect social position from the kinds of ideas that are established. And so we see within discourse theory a theoretical rationalization for precisely the kind of enfeeblement of ideology that we now take as part of that older tradition. That leads me into what might be a even more controversial kind of conclusion, which is that within post-structuralist work in particular, we see actually a similar kind of ubiquity of power within the notion, for example, of biopolitics, that it seems to me was the object of critique when that ubiquity applied to the idea of ideology. And if we're having difficulty today coming to grips with exactly what biopolitics is, what it means, what it includes, what the sharp edges of its critique are as a concept, it seems to me that a lot can be learned precisely by a parallel glance back to what happened to the notion of ideology. The ubiquity of biopolitical power, I think I would want to argue today, condemns it to a certain lack of particularity. There's not a lot of there, precisely in the same way that we found with the notion of ideology. Biopolitics becomes, and again Eagleton says this at one point, he doesn't say it about biopolitics, particularly says it about ideology. I'm going to want to extend it now to the language of discourse, and biopolitics in particular. Biopolitics becomes an empty signifier, all the more available for a certain kind of evacuation of politics and a replacement, a refueling by ethics. So, with that kind of critical glance toward discourse, let me just finish by this part of the argument by making a slightly more positive historical comment on where that discourse theory in some ways came from. It's difficult to look back at the bankruptcy of ideology within the French Marxist tradition in particular and not have sympathy for those who wanted to get away from the notion of ideology. And it seems to me that it's in that particular context that we have to understand the real reasons why discourse made some sense at the time. But I think that the moment has long passed that we need to go back and have a look now at the kind of work that discourse has done in retrospective. And it seems to me that we're now in a position where discourse has done exactly the same kind of damaging work by being all things to all people that ideology was held up for having done in that earlier period. So let me move on to the penultimate section, which is to try and reconstruct what I think of as a notion of the three intents of ideology as they emerge from Marx's work, but also from work around Marx's own work and from later work on ideology. And the argument I really want to make is that if you look back at Marx's work on ideology, there's no one particular text that formulates a theory of ideology. You can't find it here or there, or in the German ideology itself, for example. Rather, it comes up in the German ideology for sure. It comes up in the 18th Brumaire. It comes up very much in Capital, although Capital is very rarely read as a critique of ideology, despite the fact that that's the subtitle. Rather, I think what we have to do is to look through Marx's work and look for what Hegel once called the seriousness of the concept within the full body of the work. And so it seems to me there's three intents to the critical concept of ideology as Marx lays them out. Again, remember, when I'm talking about a critical concept, I mean an analysis that embodies an accusation and an imperative at the same time, again, connecting to further. The first of these three intents is what I want to call the epistemological intent of ideology. The point here is to emphasize that ideology is not just a set of ideas. It's not just a descriptor of a set of ideas. It's a way of literally knowing the world as one traverses it. In the German, perhaps Weltanschauung would be a better way of describing this. Ideologies are ideas imbricated within the life processes, the social and material relations of daily life. In Marx's own language, if in all ideology men and their circumstances appear upside down, as in a camera obscura, this phenomena arises just as much from their historical life processes as the inversion of objects on the retina does from the physical life processes. So that's the first of the intents of ideology, I'd like to argue. The second critical intent of ideology is what I would call the socio-locational intent of ideology. And here, again, what Marx argues in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte is that ideologies are ensembles of different and specifically formed feelings, illusions, and modes of thought, of views of life, which arise on the basis of the different forms of property of the social conditions of existence. The whole class, not the shift, the whole class creates and forms these out of its material foundations and the corresponding social illusions. The single individual who derives these feelings, etc., through tradition, through upbringing, and so forth, may well imagine that they form the real determinants and the starting point of his activity. Now, that's a kind of abstract idea, but it's a very simple way of looking at it. If you think of yourself in a kind of traditional, old, either medieval or early modern university quadrangle, with the pillars, the grass in the middle, and the paths around the side, and you stand at one corner of the quadrangle and you look out, you see a certain perspective on the quadrangle. Some things are blocked behind pillars, you can't see them. If you stand somewhere else, other things are blocked, but you see what's blocked from the original view. And it's in that sense, it seems to me, that Marx is saying here that particular class positions give you a particular vision of the world. Now, I would say more than half this room has already jumped to the notion of situated knowledges, which comes from, of course, Donna Haraway and her work, especially on feminism, but more broadly so. And of course, the point is that where did Haraway learn the whole argument about situated knowledges? If you look into Haraway's text, you'll find this. She derives this notion out of her reading of Marx himself. And so this notion of situated knowledges, it seems to me, is a very good way of saying in more contemporary language exactly what I'm trying to get at with the socio-locational intent of Marx's conception of ideology. Things look different when you stand in different places. Situated knowledge is indeed the right way to go. But the third kind of critical component, I think, of our notion of ideology, our concept of ideology, is what I want to call critical intent. And this may be the one that's least accepted. But it seems to me that the Marxist theory of ideology does indeed make an argument that certain forms of knowledge are wrong, are erroneous. And that's written into the conception of ideology from the start. But what does that mean? It becomes a lot trickier when you take that judgment of error apart. And effectively, I think what Marx is arguing, especially in Capital and in the German ideology, is that some forms of knowledge are less adequate a version of the world that we live in than others. And there's an insistence on making that critical judgment that some forms of knowledge are ideological vis-a-vis others. That's the critical intent. Lefebvre, again, perhaps, says it best, and this comes in his book on the sociology of knowledge, where he says that ideology really needs to be seen as, and this is the quote, an inverted, truncated, distorted reflection of reality. Now, here we begin to see the full import, I think, of the notion of the critical concept. That it is indeed, a critical concept involves an analysis. The determination of ideology involves an analysis. Critical concept involves an accusation. Yes, indeed, there's a critical accusation that certain forms of knowledge are less sufficient, less adequate than others for understanding the way the world operates. And the third of the aspects of critical concepts, that it involves an imperative. Yes, indeed, the critical intent of ideology involves an imperative to shift from idea to action in certain kinds of directions. And that, of course, is what was so threatening about the idea of ideology, the conception of ideology. And that, of course, brings us to the notion of false consciousness, popularized by Lenin. In fact, of course, false consciousness was initially coined as a term by Engels, picked up by Lenin. A judgment that Lenin was making about, in the heat of revolution in the Soviet Union, in Russia at the time, false consciousness was in many ways precisely what prevented the masses from rising for Lenin, what prevented the workers from grasping their own best interests. The important thing here, though, for Lenin was that this was a process. False consciousness was not something that was decided by diktat. There was no statement of what the proper consciousness was against which this false consciousness should be measured. the question of what amounted to false consciousness was itself always a moving target, always a process, and always in context of the social relations, the life processes, the changing material conditions. That, I think, at least, if you're going to give a generous interpretation back to Lenin, if you're going to give that kind of sympathetic reading, that indeed is what Lenin was talking about. That doesn't mean that that's how the concept of false consciousness was later elaborated in the Marxist tradition. Of course, clearly it wasn't. False consciousness did become something that was determined by diktat. But that, I think, shouldn't blind us to the possibilities within the concept of ideology generally, and certainly of the veracity of the notion of the critical intent of the concept of ideology. Now, there's a lot more that I could say about this. The point about false consciousness is that there's not a one-to-one mapping between class position, for example, and a set of appropriate ideas for understanding the world. Put differently from what I just said, that is always a struggle. It's always a struggle for consciousness, a struggle against the falsity of arguments, against the inversion that Lefebvre talked about, against the distortion, against the partiality of ideas. It becomes built into an ideological struggle itself, rather than something that's laid down by diktat. Now, if we're to take these three intents of ideology, the epistemological intent, the socio-locational intent, and the critical intent, all of which I want to argue are built into the concept of ideology in the first place. We then measure them back again against the contemporary language of discourse. We see something very interesting. It seems to me that to give a very generous reading to a sympathetic reading to the language of discourse, clearly in the best discussions of discourse there is an epistemological intent to discourse. Discourse is not just about a set of ideas unhooked, unmoored from the world. Discourse really is about how you live a life. It's about how the world is known and lived in practice, not just about a set of ideas that appear on a page or a film screen or in some other textual context. So discourse does indeed embody this epistemological intent. But after that, I think the whole point about discourse is precisely that it drops both of the other intents in the concept of ideology. The socio-locational intent is very explicitly dropped. There's no language within discourse and within discourse theory to explain to us where ideas come from, the social interests that those ideas support or challenge. No language that gives us a sense of the social location appropriate for certain kinds of discourses, and the asymmetrical interests that are advanced by certain kinds of discourses over others. Now, it's not that that kind of judgment of social location cannot be added, indeed often is added. It's quite possible to say a certain kind of discourse is supportive of a certain kind of class position or a racial politics of one sort or another, a gender politics, and so on. Absolutely. But that's a judgment that's visited in from the outside and is, in that sense, an optional extra to the theory of discourse itself. And that's important, it seems to me, because it's much more easily jettisonable. It is indeed an optional extra. The same, I think, goes for the critical intent, the third of the three intents in the concept of ideology. The critical intent is explicitly what is not there. There is indeed, as Eagleton says, a nervousness about ideology precisely because it wants to remain moored to the material and social conditions, to the social relations, to class position, to gender position, to racial position, to ethnic position, and any other social position that you want to add in. It's precisely that building in of that connection within the theory of ideology that is denied by the language of discourse, and which seems to me then leaves discourse as a very dangerous political tool, unmoored from any particular kind of political intent in the first place. So let me wrap up here with a conclusion which I hope makes some sense given the argument I've tried to lay out in rather abstract terms. And return actually to the quote that I began with from Coetzee, And remember that he's writing in a book called Waiting for the Barbarians. And it seems to me that the barbarity of empire is precisely the attempt to smooth out all of the jaggedness, the rise and fall of time and, let's say, space. And it's exactly that we're seeing right now in the revolts in North Africa and the Southwest Asia. But it's also that we're seeing in revolts in the anti-austerity movements in Europe, that we're seeing in a whole series of environmental and indigenous revolts in South America, Central America, and that we're seeing, if in very modest form, in the Wisconsin public workers takeover of the Capitol a couple of months ago, 6 weeks ago, whenever that was. Now, the point here, I think, is to emphasize from the past, we really are in a different moment from what we've been going through previously. 5 years ago, most of us really didn't have much imagination about what a different future could look like. Again, I think I've used this a couple of times, Donna Haraway in a debate at the AAG 15, 16 years ago, saying if she was really honest, she couldn't really think what a world that looked like something different from capitalism would look like, what that world would look like. And I think it's precisely the honesty, the sort of extraordinary honesty of somebody like Haraway that gets at that truth that's inside all of us, but we don't all have access to it immediately. She does, she did. That, I think, is different today. The last few years, and there's a whole set of very particular reasons we could go into, and I'm not going to right now, maybe for question time. The last few years, it seems to me, has blown apart that sense of the bubble of capitalist control over the future. New alternatives really are on the table, from Wisconsin to Tahrir. And my favorite example of this, of course, is the pizza shop, which some of you probably know about, in Madison, Wisconsin, where they kept a tally on the wall of all the pizzas that had been ordered by all the people in Tahrir Square for the workers taking over the Capitol in Madison as a sign of support. Now, when people in Tahrir Square in Cairo are buying pizzas in a shop in Madison, Wisconsin, to give to workers on a demo, protesting and taking down the Capitol in Madison, Wisconsin, you know something has changed compared to what was going on 5 years ago. Let me tie up in a second direction, however, which is to emphasize the question of the nexus between revolution and ideology. Because I kind of stressed that at the beginning, and I started by saying that the whole notion of ideology was born in the context of revolution and in the context of the aftermath of the French Revolution. And here I want to quote somebody that I don't usually quote, J.G.A. Pocock, who some of you may know as a political philosopher. But it seems to me that he's put it better than anyone on the left. Pocock would probably be fairly described as a radical liberal philosopher with a quite conservative bent. There's no contradiction there, I don't think. But he says the following, and he's talking about the aftermath of Revolution 2. Perhaps a main reason for the comparative failure of revolution as a political style in our time is that looking too hastily to the prehistoric phase of permanent, total transformation, revolutions, have failed to recognize the speed at which its own concepts become paradigms and its happenings become institutions. And so it has failed on a number of notorious occasions to control its own congelation into an authoritarian bureaucratic structure controlling men under the pretense of liberating them. Now, apart from the kind of undercurrent of glee that we can detect in Pocock's description, it seems to me that that's a very good description that ought to have been one that was able to come from the left, and ought to have been one that was associated with a critical analysis of what ideology ought to be, what it could do for us, but what it has not yet become. The point is, I think, that even amidst revolution, and this is where the anarchist takes over from the Marxist, if you like, even amidst revolution, there needs to be the keenest sense of what ideologies are out there, how ideologies operate, the critical intent of the language of ideology, in order precisely to bring about the kinds of social transformation that are required. The nexus of revolution and ideology is a nice thing for us to talk about in this room today, and absolutely vital to do so. I'm not trying to diminish the importance of that. But again, as Marx says, and I think it's the second thesis to Feuerbach, the solution to this and other kinds of problems are going to be made not so much in theory, but in practice. And so I leave you with one final thought that maybe brings together some of the arguments I've been making. And it comes from Alan Badiou, in his recent book called, as some of you probably now know, The Communist Hypothesis. So let me just read from this, and I want to emphasize that this was written before the revolts in Egypt began. Our democratic West is none too fussy about the nature of the historical fuel it uses to keep its propaganda machine running. It is true that these days it has other fish to fry. After 2 short decades of cynically unequal prosperity, the West is in the grips of a truly historic crisis, and it has to fall back on the walls and barbed wire fences to keep out foreigners. It has to fall back on a corrupt and servile media, overcrowded prisons, iniquitous legislation. It is less and less capable of corrupting its local clientele and buying off the ferocious foreign regimes of the Mubaraks and Musharrafs, who are responsible for keeping watch on the flocks of the poor. With that understanding of ideology in the context of revolution, it seems to me that the future is indeed much more open than we've been thinking about it in the past decades. Thank you.